So I don't know if you noticed this or not, but there's really no shortage of things to complain about. I'm talking about big overarching things like politics and relationships, to little things like the pizza you just pulled out of the microwave being too hot to pick up. And I wish that I could sit here and tell you that somehow the church was immune. However, it's not. If I had $1 for every time I've heard complaining in a church about staff, about the pastor, about how there aren't as many people as there used to be, well, then that church wouldn't have any money problems to complain about. It's a normal thing. We grumble, we compare, we misremember things that happened in the past, and when we do said misremembering, we usually make things better than they actually were, right? After all, the devil we know is better than the devil we don't know, right? I mean, how many back in the day stories have you heard during a complaint of something that is going on now? But you stop and realize that back in the day had its own set of issues too. Both of the lectionary readings for today have a decent amount of grumbling found within them, and it kind of makes you feel better that we're not the only ones, doesn't it? The gospel reading is filled with grumblings and misunderstandings, while the Exodus reading is grumbling about real-life concerns and whining that is exaggerated unto ridiculousness. So I guess we can get started there. Now, one might imagine that being out from underneath of Pharaoh's thumb, being out of slavery to the Egyptians, you would think that would be a good and joyous thing, right? Instead, soon after they sing God's praises for freeing them, the complaining begins. Now, to be fair to the Israelites, it's kind of understandable. I mean, of course they're panicking. They're about 6 weeks out into the wilderness, which, although that doesn't sound like a long time in the long run, especially when you stop and think that they'd be out there for 40 years, they've gone through the food they were able to pack and carry with them, and they didn't have an end in sight. They didn't have that 40-year figure. Oh, we just need to make it for 39 years and 46 more weeks or months or whatever. They didn't have an end in sight. Imagine the complaining that could have happened if they knew they'd be out there for 40 years. I mean, honestly. And no matter how adventurous it can sound to live off the land, after 6 weeks, I can see how that would be pretty old pretty quick. Now, with this realization, though, you still have to admit that when they complained, they went big. I mean, they swung big with their complaints. Maybe a little too big? We read in Chapter 16, verse 3, "If only we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots and ate our fill of bread." And I get it. Believe me, I do. When things are bad, we look back to a time and we start asking ourselves, were things really that bad? Maybe it was all in my head, or maybe I should just learn to suck it up better, and maybe I should just put my head down and keep going forward, because at least I knew what I was in for. They conveniently seemed to miss the part where they were slaves in their complaining. Also, take note of what they said. They said, we sat by the flesh pots and we ate our fill of bread. Now, a flesh pot is this big pot of simmering meat, and it sounds really good. But they were eating their fill of bread. So, wait, they were sitting next to these pots of meat, but they weren't allowed to have the actual protein. They weren't allowed to have the food that would actually help to nourish them, or nourish them better moving forward. So there was meat, but they weren't allowed any. However, like we do, we look back at memories and make them better than current circumstances in our mind's eye. Was working for that company really that bad? as you're in the midst of finding a new career, or maybe you're starting your own business and it's just really hard to get started? That's the harsh truth in this. The road to a healthier tomorrow, whether that be deciding to pursue a career that you're passionate about, but you're not quite sure where to get going, or you have to do more schooling for it. It might be getting out of an unhealthy relationship, and you ask yourself, was it really that bad being with them? Making steps towards a better financial future for yourself and your family. Oh man, I tell you what, I remember back in the day when we got to go to Olive Garden every single night for dinner. Whoo! You begin to make things not as bad in your recollection. Because right now what you're going through is really hard. But the road to a better future isn't all sunshine and roses. Yes, you can definitely celebrate the mile markers. You definitely should celebrate the mile markers. But there will always be those moments where you question if you're really doing the right thing. Especially in those moments where things seem tough. Sure, I'm in a better spot now overall. But in this particular moment, is this spot really worth this tough moment I'm in now? Then God says that God will handle it. It's almost as though God says, I know you guys are hungry. Don't worry, I'll take care of it. I will rain bread from heaven. Can you imagine that? Bread raining from the sky? I know that a lot of people try to rationalize what this is about, but at the end of the day, it's not about how to physically reproduce a phenomenon. This isn't about scientifically explaining what happened. This isn't something that needs to be explained. Instead, it's a miracle that's meant to be accepted as it is, as a sign of God's providing for those who are called. Even those being fed by this strange bread from heaven didn't understand it. They were the first-hand accounts. And we get this name for this rain bread. The name is manna. The interesting thing, though, is that manna literally translates into the question, what is it? So as people are scooping up this bread from heaven off the ground, they're referring to it as, what is it? It's the very question that the Israelites asked in verse 15. When the Israelites saw it, they said to one another, what is it? For they did not know what it was. So here's an interesting thought. These Exodus people are now being sustained and nourished by a question. What is it? I'm sure that the question could be a bit more complete than that, a bit more whole than that. Perhaps the full question ought to be, what is it that God is doing? Yes, we know that God got us out of slavery from Egypt, out of a bad situation. We're in a really tough spot right now, and God is choosing to provide for us, but the way that God is choosing to provide for us is really confusing for us in this moment. What is it that God is doing? Maybe this choice to have this manna appear every morning all around them was a way to help them actively look for God's providence in actions on a regular basis. Maybe they might learn how to see God at work even when things get difficult. Maybe especially when things get difficult in the process of moving towards a better and a healthier tomorrow. When it comes to this morning's reading from Matthew, you might come to realize that the same question is implied. What is God doing here? Here we have workers who are hired first thing in the morning and workers who are hired in the last hours of the working day. But both sets of workers are receiving the same amount of pay. I mean, what Jesus is suggesting here in this parable, in this story, is beyond belief. It's not fair. There's this question being asked, is Jesus touting fairness, or is he touting grace here? In case you haven't quite realized this yet, grace isn't fair. It's not. Grace is offering love, support, and compassion that isn't deserved. It's giving more than what's fair. What Jesus is suggesting here is offering grace to those who didn't work as much, because honestly, it's not fair that they didn't work as long, yet receive the same amount of pay. It's not fair. The people who worked all day long should, by all rights, by all means, by all fairness, should have more money, should get paid more as a result. However, Jesus is saying that here are these workers who are there, who are ready to work, just weren't picked, and just weren't picked, and just weren't picked. Until finally, at the end of the day, it's not their fault that they didn't have a job all day long, because they were right there, standing where they were supposed to all day long. We try to relegate this, though, from a financial realm to the spiritual realm. Ironically, because we're more comfortable talking about things that are spiritual than we are about how we should go about giving away our money. Bet you can't wait for stewardship campaign to begin next week. But a proper interpretation certainly is that it doesn't seem fair that the believer who came to Christ in the last minute of life gets the same reward as the believer that lived their entire life by the straight and narrow. And yet, we are reminded that we are saved not by our works, not by the time that we put in, not by the hours of pew sitting that we've done, but instead by our faith in God's grace to save us. So for those of you who are expecting all this pew time to help you be saved and get to heaven, sorry to burst your bubble. For them to get the same reward as us, well, that's not fair. And yet, and we can take that interpretation, and it's a fine interpretation. It certainly challenges us, and I think that it's an accurate one too. I think it's a fair interpretation to take. However, it might be that Jesus was literally trying to get us to rethink how we do economics. Maybe we need to rethink hours of work as what equates to fair pay, and instead learn to extend grace towards those who are trying to work but are unable to because they haven't been afforded the opportunities that others have. Maybe we need to reconsider the worth of the employee versus the worth of the manager. And I don't know, and I recognize that those can be dangerous things to consider, those can be dangerous things to bring up. But I do know that Jesus likes to turn things upside down on occasion by challenging our currently held notions. And oftentimes what he was challenging was financial issues, money issues. After all, he talked more about money than he did about heaven. Funny enough. But all of this is risky talk, to be sure. How often have we decided that changing is just too hard? Whether it be our spiritual lives, our financial lives, our personal lives, our career lives. How many times have we decided that change is just simply too hard? That we've said to ourselves that we would rather just settle for the way things are and just complain instead. Because here's the thing, folks. Change, it requires work. Change requires facing a truth that's potentially and oftentimes incredibly ugly. And sometimes we're not ready to face that truth. Sure, change is what we need to do to make things better and to set us up for a healthier life, both individually and communally in the long run. But man, is change ever hard? And can change ever be painful too? But what if? What if we shaped our world and the way that we live in it according to grace and generosity instead of by what's fair? And insisting that we get what is our due. How could that change how we go about living our lives? What we say and what we do? What would change in that regard? What would the world look like if we were to switch towards living our lives filled with grace and extending grace towards others instead of using a scorecard? Or is it even possible? I mean, it certainly requires a different way for us to measure life, not by comparisons, but we'd certainly have to set aside our jealousies and our envy in order to do so. So, what is the burden of the day? How do we labor in the Lord's vineyard without feeling like we are owed something, but instead, how do we shift our mindset towards experiencing the grace as we find the enjoyment in the service and in the connections that the service brings along with it? What kind of change might that be? Well, I would imagine that kind of change, like many changes, it would require us to settle in for the long haul. It's not a short-term thing. Yeah, things might be difficult right now, but change is for the long haul. Keep that in your mind. Remind yourself, encourage yourself. It isn't about making everything better in this moment, for this 30-second time period. Sometimes this change requires a lot of struggle in order to experience not just 30 seconds that are better for you, but years down the road, healthier and better for you. This kind of change requires us to settle in for the long haul. In this faith journey, it is to acknowledge that much of what we've learned about how the world works doesn't fit us anymore as followers of Christ. Because Jesus came and He flipped everything upside down. And it is most certainly a glorious way of living that Jesus presents to us, but is certainly a change that requires us to be in it for the long haul, and that can be really disconcerting for us, admittedly. So I guess that leads us to this question: are you willing to stick with a change that challenges you several times and in many different ways over the course of an extended period? Oftentimes personally challenging us, oftentimes as a community. Are we willing to be challenged in that way for the sake of this change for the long haul? Well, may we be a people who are willing to accept this burden of change for the sake of a better future in the kingdom of God, for a better future for all of us here on earth. God bless.